Hello to everyone watching on the Applied Linguistics blog. I'm Joe and I'm joined today by the lovely Milo Coffee. We're going to talk about our final year dissertation, or your final year dissertation.
That's right.
Fortunately, did not get to do one because I'm a joint honours student, but you have done a fantastic dissertation and scored very highly on it.
Thank you
for joining me.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be here on this brand new YouTube channel.
Well, why don't you start by explaining what your dissertation was on?
Yeah. So for my dissertation, I was working with Dr. Cornelia Chickold, and it was looking at a relatively new field, a quite exciting field, which is natural language processing. So how computers can interpret and even create language. More specifically for my project, I was looking at whether people can actually tell the difference between language which is produced by humans and language which is produced by computers. And this language took the form of poetry. So I was comparing real poems to computer-generated poems.
Oh, very nice. So it sounds a lot like computer-oriented stuff. Did you have to know a lot about robotics, computer science, things like that before you got into it?
For the actual project, not so much. I think I've got a little bit of background in computing. It's something I've always done as a hobby, you know, programming, that kind of thing. So I think that helped, and it definitely gave me the interest to embark on this project. But for the actual project itself, I wouldn't say that it was necessary to have any kind of technological background. The bits that I did need to understand, the technical aspects, were all things which I could easily find out about using the internet and talking with Cornelia and using other resources like that.
Yeah, it's pretty handy to already have an interest in computers and programming stuff before you get into a massive project like this one, I'm sure was.
Yes, well, it certainly kept me on track because I could maintain the interest in it, which I think is a key thing when you're doing a project like this.
Yeah, and that's what I've always enjoyed about the English language course in general, is that you can combine other subjects with it. Like I'm doing joint honours with media, and I've always found ways to combine media studies with my English modules. Are there any other subjects that you're interested in that you've tried to cross over?
Yeah, I'm interested in quite a few things. So I have tried to do a few out of department modules over my time at Swansea. For example, in my first year, I did a German course as one of my modules as part of the Languages for All program. And German is not a language which I had any background in prior to coming to uni, but I saw it there and I thought, let's give that a go. Why not? As an English language student, as a linguistics student, I have an interest in languages, and I thought, why not try something new?
Exactly. Why not look at all the other languages as well?
Yeah. You can never have too many, in my opinion.
Now, I'm not 100% sure how it works with choosing topics for your research projects. Did you get to choose what topic you did, or did you come up with it yourself?
Well, there is definitely an element of choice, but it's a guided choice, I would say. What happened this year, and I'm not sure this is what usually happens, but what happened this year was the department, each lecturer kind of had a topic area which they were interested in supervising projects in. So for example, Tess was doing things about word association, Vivian was looking at language learning aptitude, and so on. But other lecturers such as Cornelia, such as Alexia, kind of gave a much broader area. So Cornelia said things to do with computer-assisted language learning, things to do with natural language processing, and I think Alexia was looking at gender language, use of pronouns, that kind of thing. And for those kind of projects, there was a lot more scope for us as students to kind of decide exactly what we'd like to do.
Yeah, because now you mention it, it does make sense that Cornelia would do something to do with computer-assisted language learning, because we did her module titled exactly that just this year. So So have that going alongside your dissertation as well?
So what's that, sorry?
Was it nice to have the computer-assisted language learning module alongside working on your research project this year?
Yeah, it was actually. It was, there wasn't an awful lot of crossover, I'd say, between the two, but it was kind of nice to see another side of a related subject. So you could kind of see, okay, we can use computers for this kind of area of linguistics, for language learning, for practicing vocabulary. but we can also use computers for something completely different. But it's still that kind of combination of technology and linguistic knowledge, which I find really interesting.
Now, I wanted to ask a question. You might not know the answer to this, but I want you to give me an estimate on how much time you think you spent working on your research project.
Oh, that's a hard one. We were given a Gantt chart to plan this out, but I didn't really end up using that particularly. So I was kind of working on a basis of what needs to be done, if and when.
I prefer doing that as well.
Yeah, I think it's just different things work for different people. Some people would prefer to plan it all out, and then other people would prefer to take it as it comes, and I'm definitely in that latter group. As for an actual estimate, though, I wouldn't even know. I was spending at least 3 days a week, most of the day, working on the project alongside my other things. Those might not be 3 full days, but they would be sort of the equivalent of that time spread out through the week.
Yeah.
And that would be reading literature, writing things up, making notes, data analysis. You know, depending on where I was in the project, there was always some different tasks which needed to be done. So at the start of the week, I'd kind of plan out what I needed to do by the end of the week, and then kind of approach it that way.
Okay, nice. Because it must be difficult because you have to do it alongside 2 regular modules as well. Which modules did you do in the second semester when you were working on the research project?
Yeah, well, we've already talked about computer-assisted language learning, Cornelia's module, but I also did language in the media with Dr. Ben Jones. And that was a really fascinating module, and it was really nice to spend some time doing something that was completely different from my research project and from the core module, looking at a completely different area of language science. And yeah, I really enjoyed that module. And I think having that difference, having that that sort of different subject matter was actually really beneficial, because you could just take your mind off one of them and focus entirely on the other one for a bit. And then when you came back to, say, the dissertation after, working on Ben's module, there was, you might have some new ideas, you might think of something, a different way to approach something, perhaps. So yeah, it was nice to have that kind of variation, I think, in what we were doing.
Oh yeah, I absolutely loved that module as well, because I'm part media student as well. So as soon as I saw something titled language in the media, I jumped straight on it.
Yeah.
I've always said to my friends is media is a great subject for that, because when you're doing homework or things outside the lecture, you're just reading comic books or watching TV shows or films, and it's perfect.
Right. Yeah, it's a really interesting subject area, and I like that module because it was a nice opportunity to apply some of the more theoretical things that we'd learned in discourse analysis to some everyday language, like your comic books, for example, or like television programs, or I found that a really interesting module and a nice break, I suppose, from working on the dissertation. Right,
now I want to ask, what do you think the biggest challenge was for you personally in writing the dissertation?
Right, the biggest challenge for me personally, I think the thing which I found most difficult throughout the project was thinking about how to go about organizing my data to analyze using statistics. As someone who's always sort of enjoyed maths, but struggled a bit when it comes to the more statistics side, like averages, like graphs and all that kind of thing, I found that a bit difficult. And it took me a lot of kind of rough work, a lot of sketching things on paper and drawing up like sort of sketches of tables and graphs to kind of think about ways to approach analyzing that data. So that did take a bit of thinking about, just to get in a form which I could apply what we'd learned in doing a research project, which is the first semester module, which kind of leads into the dissertation. Because obviously the sort of scenarios which we come across in that module are kind of contrived in a sense. They're from a textbook, they're not real data, and you don't come across the same kind of challenges as you do when you actually get real data from the real world, because people do things which you don't expect them to do.
Exactly. I'm sure it's always much easier to read it from a textbook when it comes to doing it.
Sure.
Problems you never even thought of.
Yes, that's right. But
I'm shocked to hear that an English student actually likes maths as well. I think you're the only one that I've ever met who's enjoyed maths at any point on this course.
I do like maths. I did an A level in maths even.
Perfect.
Before coming here, but yeah, I think I could only take it so far, and it was nice to have that background. But I'm glad it didn't get any more complicated than it did.
Fair enough. Now, the thing I wanted to ask. Again, I'm not entirely sure how it worked because I didn't do the research project. I know you have a supervisor. Yours was Cornelia.
Yeah, that's right.
You obviously choose the topic, and then I'm assuming they had some kind of supportive role, but how much influence did they have on your actual dissertation, or were they just there for guidelines?
Yeah, so I think it really depends on the project as a whole. For example, I know that Alex Torrey and Richard Reed, who worked on Vivian's project, they both had a good deal more input because it was an actual research project which Vivian was running, and they needed to really collaborate on this so that they could make sure they were all following the same conventions with coding data, for example. Thinking about different ways to analyze the data that are kind of consistent across the project. For me, though, that wasn't so important since this was a project which I kind of thought up the basis of myself. I thought up the research questions and the way to the methods, the way to get the data. So Cornelia was more in, like you say, an advisory role here, giving me some input on things like the methodological approach which I used, my questionnaire, my even my write-up. I sent her chapters of my dissertation, I'd say, I've written this literature review, can you have a look at it and tell me if you think I've missed anything out? And I'd send it off, and a few days later she might come back and say, it looks good, but maybe you need to add this and that, or reword this maybe. So it was much more of that kind of just kind of checking in, making sure I was on the right track with things, for me anyway. And like I say, I think different projects probably require different amounts of input from the supervisors.
And did you ever have any issues when you weren't on track and you needed to desperately emailing Cornelia at 1 a.m. trying to work out what's going on, anything like that?
Thankfully, I managed to avoid that with this project, but I'm sure she would have responded and helped me out if I needed that situation. She's very good at that kind of thing.
I like to think she's got it on alert constantly. Like if you email her, there's a notification and she wakes up out of bed straight to the computer and helps you out straight away. You haven't given us too much detail about what you actually found out in your study. Could you just briefly explain what your results were, what you discovered? Yeah,
absolutely. So, like I say, I was looking at whether people could actually distinguish between real and computer-generated poems. And it turns out that they can't, which is a really interesting result. So I've actually got the stats in front of me here, so I can refer to
lovely.
And participants correctly identified the provenance of the poem, so that's whether they were written by people or by the computer system, only 49% of the time. So that's actually less than chance level across the 10 poems which they were looking at. So that would mean that if they were just guessing randomly, if they weren't thinking about it, then it's actually less than that level. And that's fascinating because that shows that people actually really struggle to tell the difference, at least in my sample, between these poems. And one of the things which I think you can take from that is that these computer systems which produce language these days are actually really high quality and are actually able to fool people into thinking that it's another person. Kind of related to that, I asked participants to judge their confidence in their guesses. So how sure are they that it's a computer-generated poem, or how sure are they that it's a real poem? And people weren't very good at that either, as it happened. Their confidence in their decisions didn't actually line up with their performance across guessing the poems. And you can take from that perhaps that the people think they're better at knowing what's real and what's not than they actually are. And that's something which you could construe as a problem, looking at things like fake news perhaps, computer-generated headlines. How can we tell if these are actually genuine or not?
Oh, that is interesting.
So that would be something that I think a follow-up project would be really interesting for them to have a look at. And the last thing I found out, the last one of my main findings, was that I asked people to judge whether they thought each of the poems they looked at, because all these poems were anonymized, they didn't know if it was real or not, as I said. I asked them to judge whether each poem was how readable it was. You know, was it difficult to read this poem? Were there difficult words in it, perhaps?
That's for a review of each poem.
Yeah. Their kind of emotional response to it. You know, how did this make? Did you think this was an emotional poem or not? And how much they enjoyed it as well. Because you know, you read poems, you enjoy some, you don't enjoy others. What I did to analyze that was just kind of compare what people said about the AI poems, the computer-generated poems, to the real poems, and I found out that there wasn't really any difference between how people rated the two. So there wasn't. My stats kind of confirmed that there wasn't any significant difference in how people judged the computer-generated poems in terms of, say, readability, enjoyment, etc., to the human poems. And I thought that was a really interesting finding as well, because it shows that people can actually have an emotional response to something that was produced by a machine at the end of the day.
Oh wow, that's a scary thought, though, isn't it?
It is. It's a fascinating subject, like I say, and I think there's a lot of moral issues which this kind of brings up, which again is something you could build an entire research project around.
I know you had to consider all the ethics behind all your research projects. Were there any difficulties with what you had to do?
For me, no. It was what Cornelia referred to as a light touch ethics approach, where it was just a case of logging into the intranet, filling out a form, just saying, I'm not going to, subject anyone to electric shocks, what have you. And
as long as no one's traumatized by reading a robot, everything's fine.
Well, we can hope not, anyway. Yeah.
So you reckon that your results were a result of the poems being written by the AI being good poems rather than bad ones written by humans? But just out of curiosity, where did you get the human poetry? Did you write it yourself, or poetry?
I'm not a talented poet by any means, so I did have to refer to some published material. What I did, it was a really basic selection process, but I think one that works fine, is that I went around my house, I piled up the poetry books that I had, and I opened each one at a random page and looked at the poem that was on the left-hand side and copied that down and used that 5 times.
Very nice. And what methodology did you cite for that? Is that just the Milo coffee approach?
That's the Milo coffee approach, yeah. I thought about using some sort of online approach, maybe looking through a large corpus, and then I thought, well, it doesn't really matter. I think I can get the same variation just by looking through books that I have. They're all poetry from the 20th century, kind of more modern things.
Okay.
I think that was good because it didn't mean that there was a lot of variation between each one, which could obviously cause some difficulties when it comes to analysis. But if someone was going to do this again, it might be interesting to look at poems across a longer period of time, maybe some Shakespearean sonnets, perhaps, because they've got a really different form to...
Yeah, maybe different genres are easier to distinguish from AI, who knows?
Possibly, and that would be something which would be really interesting to find out about as well.
And just one final question. How do you get a robot to write a poem? Not get murderer. How do you actually come up with this AI poetry?
It's a complicated process, and I have to admit I don't understand all the ins and outs of it. There's a lot of really complicated computer science going on there. But in basic terms, how it works is the system which is produced by the computer engineers, the programmers, is designed to read a large corpus of text. So, for example, if you wanted to produce a poetry generating machine, you give it a large corpus of poems to read, and you can make that specific or as general as you like. You could some of the papers I read for my literature review produced for example a program which produced verse in the style of Lord Byron, for example, just in the style of Lord Byron, or prose in the style of Charles Dickens. So they went really specific with what they trained it to do. So the computer, it analyzes all that text, it goes through it, and it looks for patterns. So it looks, okay, these two words seem to occur quite close together a lot of the time. This is something which maybe is representative of this genre. So what it does, it has them all in its memory, these little combinations, and it's almost like a tally. It increases the number whenever it sees one of these things. And in that way, we can kind of start to establish, okay, these are frequent features that we find in this genre. And that doesn't just work for words, it works for structures as well. So we can look at, okay, a sentence with this structure sometimes appears with a sentence with this structure. This must be something which is typical of the genre. And you go through and the system kind of adds these up as it goes along. And it gets to the point where it can really start to recognize what might be in this genre or not. And once we've got all these patterns in, it can begin then to start to put together new data from what it's read before. So you can feed it a prompt. You can give it something like, what I did to generate mine was give it the first line of real poems. So I go through in the same way I said, I'd open a book, read the first line and put that into the program. I didn't create this program, by the way, it was one that was available online. And what it would do, it would use that line and all the corpus that it studied, and it would think about those patterns, and it would attempt then to continue from the first line, thinking about, okay, when we've got sentences like this usually come after, so it would add something in like that, and it would go through in that process until you've got something which resembles a poem.
Wow. I mean, I never thought, I'm sure Charles Dickens never would have thought that his poetry would be recreated by a computer hundreds of years in the future.
No, I'm sure he didn't. In fact, an interesting aside, these poetry, the idea of poetry generation, of automatic poetry generation, does actually date back as far as the time of Dickens.
Really?
When some madcap Victorian engineer decided to try and produce a mechanical device that would string together lines of poetry and produce something new. And as you'd expect, it didn't really work. He didn't really get very far with it. But it just goes to show how long the interest in this has been going back. You know,
I guess that was the seed that grew into what we have now.
Yeah, well, exactly. Obviously, this all took off around the 1940s when computers kind of became much more prevalent in society. But yeah, the idea does go back quite far, and I thought that was really interesting.
And thank you very much for joining me on the blog.
You're very welcome.
We've got a link to your Twitter. It'll be under the video on the blog.
That's great.
And that, thank you for everything. And hope you have a lovely day.
Thank you. You too.